morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. I'm Julie Rowine. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Concord Carlisle, and I would like to welcome you to our January 1st Friday program. On the second Friday this month, I imagine you were all still recovering from the holidays last week. And this program is to talk about Concord and about how our tax dollars are spent. I saw the hand, thank you. The First Friday series, which is now at least in its 5th year. Marge, do you remember what year we started this? No, that's okay. It's been a while. Has been ably organized over those years by our Concord Town Government Committee. Artis Boardman is the longtime chair of that committee and joined this year by Dory Kehoe as co-chair. We have programs on the first Friday throughout the year on topics of interest regarding our local government. And they have become so well attended that we are having to look at alternate rooms with more space, which is a wonderful measure of the success of this idea, I think. I want to tell you before we move on to this morning's program about next month. We will have our First Friday program on February 7th. And it will focus on the Concord Middle School building project and the feasibility study. I hope you'll be able to join us.
Where will it be?
We hope here, if we can get this place.
It will be here as far as, but we're still confirming the details. So, and on January 18th, we are having our annual winter breakfast featuring author Laura Harrington, who wrote the book and lyrics for the musical The Perfect 36, which is about the ratification fight in Tennessee to get women the vote and get the 19th Amendment adopted. If you are interested in attending, our treasurer, Robert Tilsinger, is in the back, and you can speak to him about getting your name on the list and giving him a check. The League is a nonpartisan organization. We do not support or oppose candidates or parties, but we do work on issues, and we are particularly concerned with good governance and citizen participation in government. This includes fiscal responsibility and prudent management of resources to meet the many needs of our community. Concord is a community with a wide array of assets, certainly in the financial and material, but perhaps more importantly in its people, including the dedicated and thoughtful residents who give of their time and experience and expertise to make our town a better place. In today's program, we will be hearing about how Concord is managing its fiscal resources in the present. We will also hear ideas of how we might make improvements in the future. We will learn about how budgets are formed and the categories of spending that must be addressed. For example, operating costs for the town, school expenditures, debt service, employee benefits, capital projects, ... Forming budgets requires balancing the needs of the community with the available resources. There is concern that increasing costs can result in some residents actually leaving town. And there are costs that are known well in advance and costs that can arise suddenly. Perhaps an emergent safety issue or a newly identified need. While no planning process can ever cover every possibility, longer range planning, particularly of capital projects, we think can reduce the surprises and allow for a more measured consideration of the balance that we must strike between community needs and resources. I will get us started this morning by introducing our moderator, Mr. Tom Swain. Mr. Swain is an attorney who has served Concord as town council. He was the vice chair of the Town Governance Study Committee, which produced its final report in August of 2014, and has served most recently on the Finance Committee. And I will turn the meeting over to Mr. Swain.
Thank you. It is good to see all of you here this morning. I may welcome you. We do have one replacement. Carrie LaFleur was scheduled to be with us, but due to some family issues, she's not able to be here, but we think we found a good substitute. Mr. Stephen Mr. Stephen Crane, otherwise known as our town manager, has kindly agreed to step in. I did have some doubts about him because I saw that he had previously served the town of Longmeadow and some other great places. But I have very difficult memories at Long Meadow because one of my sons played a lot of lacrosse at CCHS, and Long Meadow always beat us in the state tournament. But he was not there at that time, so welcome. Good to have you here. We also will have other speakers that we'll identify as their time comes due. We have somebody paying attention to the time. Ingrid has a little sign that will let the speakers know when their 20 minutes is up. Following each of the three speakers, we will take questions, either written or you can just stand up and ask your questions, and I will direct that question to whomever is most likely able to answer it. We would ask that when you do your questions, that it be a question and not that you're giving your opinion or your concern about anything in particular, so that the speakers can respond to answer your question. I believe that each of them brings something special to this meeting that you will be interested to hear. Mary has extensive background, is currently on the Finance Committee, and we even have invited a out-of-town guest from a little place up here on the right-hand side of the town. And you're going to hear, because he has some extensive experience in Westford with their capital planning committees, as well as a selectman, I believe chairman now, current chairman in that town. So we are honored to have them. Dory deserves a special credit, along with Artis, I think I saw her somewhere back there, who helped put this together. And they spent a lot of effort as people, either in Carrie's case, family difficulties, and one of our other presenters got sick yesterday. So you've done yeoman duty. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Stephen Crane, our town manager, and welcome him not only to Concord but to this meeting. Stephen?
It's okay if I use the podium. Good morning, everyone. And I'm sorry that you were stuck with me instead of Carrie. I am a poor substitute, but I will do the best I can. So I just want to address actually a important question that I get. Do you have my slides?
I have to figure out how to switch from Mary's to yours. We'll be there in 1 second.
I'll give Mary's presentation.
Okay.
So I get at a kind of an important question that I get asked a lot. Is it Steve or Steve? And the answer is always I usually don't. First of all, I don't really care, and I usually don't even notice. I've been called many things in my career, so either of those is preferable to many of the other names I've been called. And the only one I don't want to be called is Mr. Crane. That's my dad. So now that I've dispensed with the formalities, I just want to talk a little bit about the budget process. Concord, I think, befitting the level of engagement and involvement of the community in government process, which has been probably the most significant thing that I have learned about Concord since I've been here, and the most impressive thing, I think, about the community from a local government standpoint is that engagement. So it's no surprise that, if you want to go to the next slide, Stephen, that we spend 12 months of the year doing the budget process. The budget goes into effect on July 1st, and by July 31st, we're already talking about the guidelines for the following year. And that takes us all the way through the April 30th town meeting. And you all know this, the budget gets kind of finalized at the end of the year, and then I will be presenting the town manager's budget to the select board on January 27th, so in a couple weeks. So guidelines versus non-guideline spending. The Finance Committee does issue a guideline for both the town side budget and the school side budget. And there are many factors that go into that. I commend the Finance Committee. They spend a lot of time thinking about, talking about, and deciding on the budget guidelines. There are things here there are two categories, non-guidelines and guideline kind of eligible, or what gets counted towards the guidelines. You could also probably fairly describe most of this as either non-discretionary and discretionary. The non-guideline things are employee benefits, health insurance, retirement OPEB, fixed expenses, debt service, and then other community assessments. And those are really non-discretionary because they are costs that they're not budgeted costs that the town departments control individually. They are things that either we get assessed or are derivatives of our payroll or what have you. And so then you have the town under, so what the guideline applies to is the operating budget, Concord Public Schools operating, and then the regional school district's operating budget. So this is my first budget here in Concord, but I will tell you that my ultimate goal is to have all municipal spending comply with the guidelines, and I really look forward to working with the Finance Committee on how we can do that. One of the things we talked about, just as an aside, is zero-based budgeting. And one of the reasons why I have suggested that zero-based budgeting is somewhat of a misnomer is that, you know, by the time you get done stripping out non-discretionary funding out of the annual budget, it's not a high percentage of the budget left to deal with, and so you can't zero out those top items. You can't. Your bondholders aren't going to take too kindly to the idea that, you know what, the debt service payments are on the table this year. We'll let you know after town meeting if we're going to meet our obligation. Like, they don't really. That would hurt. You wouldn't be AAA if you were doing that. So, and so I just want. But when you get to the other side, the discretionary side, that's where we do apply the principles of zero-based budgeting. Review each line item. Review the line item history. If you ask for 20 every year, but you only spend 5, then we'll give you 5. And if you need more, we'll find a way to get you more. And so. Are we getting a great value? Is that service needed? Talking a little bit about attrition, but the training line item for departments, for public safety departments, there's been a lot of turnover at both police and fire, a lot of retirements and a lot of younger people coming in, which has yielded that attrition savings I'm going to mention in a little bit. But that means you have a younger, less experienced, less trained department. So even though the budget line item for training may have been, $50,000, and I'm making numbers up here, should it be $80,000 because we have a bunch of younger people? So that's like a year-over-year shift that you make based on what's actually happening in the department. So you can call that zero-based budgeting if you want, but that's how we do it. So next slide. So then there's operating budget versus capital budget. So operating is departmental expenses, employee benefits. You can see that I'm not going to read all these line items here. It's basically the money we spend to keep the trains running on time. And then the capital is either individual purchases of a significant size or projects of a significant size. In Concord, there are 2 kinds of capital: pay-go or cash capital, and that is money that is carried in the general fund budget specifically for capital items. And capital items, I believe, it's greater than useful life of greater than 1 year and less than 100,000. We'll pay cash for it, so then you avoid the debt service costs and interest that you would pay if you borrowed that money. And then there is debt, and that's done through a warrant article that issues debt for projects, and again, greater than 100,000 and a useful life of greater than 5 years to kind of meet that true capital threshold. So one of the things we're doing new for FY21 is taking the cash capital projects out of the budget warrant article and putting all capital into a capital plan warrant article. It's something that I'm used to doing. It's how we did it. I came from, as Tom mentioned, I came from Long Meadow. That's how we did it there. I think it's a little clearer, and once it's in the warrant article, if something happens and you can't do the project for whatever reason in a given year, the appropriation for that project stays because it's on the warrant article, as opposed to having to be closed out at the end of the fiscal year. And I will give Kerry LaFleur credit for really pushing to do that. It's a good idea. Next slide. Okay, so revenue sources. So how do we make it rain here? So revenue sources to support municipal spending. Primary one is Proposition 2.5, and that is impacted by both our levy limit and then excess levy capacity we have. I think Concord is fortunate to have a mill rate that I think is pretty reasonable given the level of service that the town provides to the community. I know Long Meadow has the highest tax rate in the Commonwealth. You can't have a mill rate higher than $25 per thousand, and Long Meadow's is like $24.50. It's a AA2 bond rated town. It's not profligate spending. It's just low property value growth in Western Mass. Concord's values are high, and so the tax rate of about $15 per thousand really is a good indicator of a healthy community, both financially healthy, but also from a property value standpoint, very healthy. So, and I do know that we don't tax to the full extent of the levy that's available. So then you have state aid. State aid is usually demonstrated on what's called the cherry sheet. Does anybody know why it's called the cherry sheet? Oh, you guys are so good. That's good. There aren't a lot of townspeople that would know the answer to that. So it was the red paper that they used to print it on. So, and that of course includes educational aid, UGA, unrestricted general government aid, and used to call it lottery aid. So those are the things that, like, the schools get theirs from Chapter 70, town gets it from unrestricted government aid. We also get Chapter 90 for roads, bridges, things like that. Then we have local receipts, motor vehicle excise tax, meals and rooms tax, local fines and fees, for example, building permits. We assess fees, as you all know, for a lot of things, but building permits is kind of the easy example. And then investment income, the town has investments that it makes to protect its reserves, and we earn interest on those investments. And then we have available funds. So you have free cash, which is undesignated fund balance, and then you have accumulation of revenue in expense of estimates. And so, you know, free cash gets certified annually by DOR, but I've never understood why we call it free cash. It's not free. It's tax money. And really, free cash is really the result, as the slide notes, of really conservative revenue estimating, and then good operational performance for the budget. You don't budget for free cash necessarily, but you always plan to have some at the end of the year because it's a sign that you didn't overshoot the mark on the revenue and you really did a good job, you know, holding the line on spending and finding value and efficiency throughout the year. And budgeting really is 365 days a year in that regard, because you're always tracking what you're spending and tracking, you know, the unforeseen circumstances and making sure that next year's budget reflects those things, those changes. So there's a key fundamental difference between the town and school appropriation. The town has 15 appropriations, and then the town manager must balance the budget to the individual legal appropriations. And you know, there's certain categories: public safety, you know, community service, public works. There's specific categories, and when you get the appropriations in those categories, those expenditures must be used for those individual categories. So CPW can transfer money from, say, sidewalks to potholes, but we can't transfer money from potholes to new fire hose. Except for in the last month of the fiscal year, with approval of the select board and the finance committee, you can make interfund transfers. So it really, and you also have the reserve, the finance committee controls the reserve fund. Mary, I assume you're going to talk about that. Oh, okay. So there's a reserve fund. Is it $200,000?
$225,000.
So there's a reserve fund of $225,000 that is under that is under the purview of the finance committee, and it's there for unforeseen circumstances or you know, budgetary shortfalls that may need to be backfilled in kind of an emergency fund. So the schools have one legal appropriation. Basically, the schools can flex money around any which way they choose, and I think that's important for the schools because they don't control who's going to move in and out of a town or enroll in a district, and as you know, they are legally mandated to provide services, especially in the area of special education, and those services can be costly to provide. So the schools have the benefit of that flexibility to meet, you know, kind of unforeseen, not unforeseen, but new circumstances that emerge during the year, which I think is I don't want to step on the school's toes, but it's a pretty regular thing, and so it's good that they have that flexibility. Okay, so the budget that I will be submitting, that I didn't submit to the Finance Committee, will be submitting to the Select Board, it is balanced, and it does meet the Finance Committee's guidelines of 2.5%. One of the things that, when we talk about kind of growth in taxation, many years ago, as I said, as everyone here knows, the citizens of Massachusetts decided that 2.5% growth in operational spending is a reasonable amount year over year. That's why we have Prop 2.5. And so the 2.5%, that was the budget target, that was the budget guideline, was something that I felt strongly we needed to meet. And we were able to do that while not only preserving the existing high quality services that Concordians enjoy from their town government, but also enhancing a few areas that I had noted just early on were needs. And I know that the Select Board, remember, I think the three of you are here, Linda, Susan, and Terry? Yes, okay. Yeah, I was to say, they can't talk to each other. That's a,
No.
yeah. So they had some priorities that they had identified as well, and so we wanted to incorporate those. So I don't need to go through the whole list, but legal services, I think it's pretty well documented that we've had some high-level legal expenses. So we want to enhance that for next year. Visitor center, we want the visitor center. We have a tourism coordinator now. If you haven't met Beth Williams, she's fantastic. And I know that there was a need for an economic vitality, more effort for economic vitality for the community. Tourism and economic vitality, especially in a place like Concord that is such a desirable destination, really are inextricably linked. And so we are putting some money in to elevate the tourism coordinator position to an economic vitality and tourism coordinator position. We're fortunate that Beth has the skills that you need to do that. And then we're also going to add a part-timer to kind of backfill her time, seasonally at the visitor center. So we haven't framed out how that's going to look 100%, but we're excited to kind of branch out into that area. So then facilities, we have a facilities division. It's relatively new. It's a few years old. It's been budgeted a little bit differently. Some of the operating expenses were budgeted as capital because they were trying to figure out what is the facilities division going to do, what's the area of responsibility, the scope of their work, so to speak. Now that it's kind of growing up, we're getting a better sense of what they can handle and what they should be doing. So we are consolidating. Each department had their own building maintenance and maintenance expense line items. We're taking those out of the individual department line budgets and putting them into facilities. So if you look at the budget, the facilities department's budget is going to look like it just exploded, but it's offset by reductions in the other departments. And we took all those amounts, consolidated them, and gave them a $20,000 haircut because we do believe that we can create a lot of efficiency by having it all managed by the facilities department. We have 3 elections in FY21. I think, which is really 2020, calendar year 2020. I think there's a presidential election in November. I may have heard something about that. And then, so that's obviously a big budget for this year, big budget increase. The town owns a lot of land, I have observed, more than any place I've ever been. And I know what a high value that is for Concord, and so we don't really do much to maintain that land. And so we are adding a land manager position. We are also we're elevating the staff wages for senior staff in the outreach department, and I don't know if anybody's heard, but we did have one of our outreach people pass away unexpectedly, so Sharon from the COA, so I'm sorry to deliver that news. But they're really underpaid, and we want to give them a fair market adjustment. We are adding a dispatcher overnight to the police department dispatches police and fire. I will tell you that Long Meadow and the city of Chicopee formed a regional dispatch, so it just so happens that I know a lot more about public safety dispatching than I probably should. And adding 2 dispatchers per shift, I think, is a mandate that's going to be coming down the line anyway. So the chiefs identified that as a service need. So and then the fire department, they expanded fire department positions. They added a number of FTEs, I think, over the last few years. Okay, got it. This is not adding any positions. It's just changing the management structure so you have a captain and a lieutenant on every shift. So you have more supervisory authority. So next slide.
Can I ask you a question on the legal services?
Let me just get through that.
I'll recognize you soon, though, sir.
So, because I just get the 5-minute, I get the high five. So, so one of the reasons why we really do that, meet the guidelines and expand services, like I said, is attrition. Firefighter or police officer retires at the top of the scale. You hire somebody at the bottom of the scale. It yields some savings. Those savings don't go off into the future, so we want to make sure we balance out those increases to make sure we're not relying on attrition that won't be there as those new employees move up the scale. So just looking ahead, future capital, we've got large projects, middle school, public safety complex, public works complex, administrative offices, enterprise improvements, enterprise obviously being water, sewer, CMLP. So there is a capital planning task force. We are working diligently to figure out, not to figure out, but to kind of identify what's our capital planning process, how those decisions get made, and how the priorities happen. I did present the town's priorities for facilities. I think back in the fall, we did a town-wide facilities assessment, so that information's on the website. It's just a 2-page memo. But these are the ones we're looking ahead. And then we have medium-scale park improvements. White and Giroux Park are the most notable, I think. Road improvements. We did some land acquisitions that may be planned, and then, of course, replacement and/or rehabilitation of fire trucks and ambulances. Yeah, so questions or comments, that's it, sorry, I know I went pretty fast.
Can we hold the questions until the end of the presentation by the other two speakers? Thank you,
Moderator.
sir. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Mary Hartman, the lady to my left. I got to know Mary on the Finance Committee, and she is going to discuss some of those issues, particularly sustainable growth. And with that, I turn it over to Mary.
Thanks, Tom. Good morning. I'm here this morning to talk about how the Finance Committee interacts or participates in the budget process. So my presentation is a little bit more high level. I want to start by just reminding us that the Finance Committee, next slide please, is an advisory board. Okay, I'm sure that after Stephen's presentation you have an appreciation for how complicated this whole process is. And the Finance Committee is a group of 15 people who study it all year long. So we pay attention, we ask questions, we deliberate thoughtfully, and at the end of all of that work, we come to the town with recommendations. So we're really financial advisors. So our job is to advise you. It's up to you whether you want to take our advice or not. Okay? So we do the work, we come with an opinion or a recommendation to you. But as far as the budget goes, we usually, our participation in the budget consists of 3 areas. The first is the guideline process. The second is we make recommendations on specific warrant articles at town meeting. And the third is, these are out. There, thank you. The guideline process, the second is we make recommendations on certain articles at town meeting. And the third is that according to the bylaw, we're required to publish a 5-year projection of where we think property taxes are going over the next 5 years. So I'm going to talk about each of these individually. Okay, so the first is the guideline process. Next slide, please. So the guideline process begins, as Stephen pointed out, way back in August, when we sit down and we talk with the spenders or the people who provide services, the town, the CPS, and the high school. And we ask them, what are driving your costs? Let us know what's happening with your spending. And based on that, we issue a guideline percent saying this is the amount that your budget can increase year over year. Currently, we have incorporated something called the sustainable growth rate in our deliberations. So it used to be we would talk to the spending people and we would say, what's happening, and we'd come up with a number. And now we're actually bringing something else into the discussion called the sustainable growth rate. So what's the story behind the sustainable growth rate? Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. This slide just shows the growth in our taxes from FY09 through FY21. FY21 is obviously projected. And you can see that they're going up, and this isn't surprising, we all know this. These two lines are different because this is the tax bill on the median value, and this is the tax bill on an average. Average is higher because we have a lot of very expensive properties that pulls up the average. So a better metric would really be the median tax bill, and it's going up, and we project that in FY21, the tax bill for a median house will be about $13,549. Next slide, please. But one of the Finance Committee members, Scott Randall, said, well, yes, there's a slope to that line, right? It would be helpful if we could compare it to how other costs are going up to see if it's in line or not. So what we've got here is we've got a graph that shows the growth in our tax bill from 2009 through 2019, and we're comparing that to other indices of growth and costs. And some of these are median value of a home, another is CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, another is employment costs, and the fourth is the 10-year Treasury note. And the 10-year Treasury note is a proxy for what the market thinks inflation is going to be. So we're saying, okay, taxes are going up, but how are they going up relative to other indices that show how prices are going up? And we see that taxes are going up a lot faster, okay? And this was concern to us. I want to stop here and say, there's nothing sinister going on here as far as the increase in taxes. Okay? This is because the town offers or we ask for services that cost money. But it's the Finance Committee's job to remind us that these things cost money, sometimes a lot of money, okay? And can we afford that? So the role of the Finance Committee is really to remind us that we're spending more and faster than many other indices in the market are growing. Next slide, please. So the sustainable growth rate, what is it? This is the fine print. You can read that if you want to, but if you really want to get down to what is the sustainable growth rate, it's the rate that allows Concord to maintain the best town government and schools that we can afford. So we're simply asking to balance some of the growth with what we can afford. Next slide, please. So how are we going to use the sustainable growth rate? So the sustainable growth rate is going to be used to inform our guideline setting process. So it's not realistic for us to think that we're going to all of a sudden grow at a sustainable growth rate. But what we're saying is we should keep that in mind when we're developing the guideline. So we have a guideline, and we should keep it in mind, what is the sustainable growth rate? And in the long term, let's make those come closer together. It also helps us support multi-year agreements that the town enters into. Those are things like collective bargaining agreements, lease payments, and other things. Oh, and the planning and timing of capital projects. Okay, so this is a rate that I think will be helpful when we negotiate these things. And as you know, collective bargaining and labor costs are a huge portion of our budget. I think in the schools it's as high as 80%, like 70 or 80%.
It's depending on the district, but
Yeah,
it can be.
yeah. So these agreements that we enter into have a huge impact on the growth in our budget. So if we can publish a sustainable growth rate, it's just one number that helps the negotiators. Next slide, please. Okay, that was the guideline process. We have a guideline process, we set a number, we use the sustainable growth rate as to help us set what we think is a reasonable number. But there are limitations to the guideline process. And the first limitation is that, as Stephen pointed out, the guidelines only cover operating costs, current operating costs, which is limited to 77% of our total budget. So our total budget last year was $114 million. Whoops, a few zeros there. But the guideline process only covers 77% of that. It does not include things like spending for excluded debt or other fixed costs, as Stephen mentioned earlier. These types of things are added to the budget at town meeting, many of them. And the Finance Committee, therefore, makes a recommendation on these types of additions to the budget that are voted at town meeting. So that gets into the second way that we participate in the budget process, which is to make recommendations to specific warrant articles that come up at town meeting. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. And recent warrant articles that we have made recommendations on that come up at town meeting. So these aren't part of the guideline, these aren't current spending, this is new spending that's being added to the budget on the floor of town meeting. Recent ones, you remember, I'm sure remembers these, things like property tax used for affordable housing, for the feasibility study for the middle school, the White Pond acceptance and the capital spending that was going to result because of the acceptance of that property, and the Giroux property acquisition and improvement. So these are just a random sampling of some of the things that we vote at town meeting that increase our spending that are outside of the Finance Committee's guideline process. Okay, next. And then the final thing that the Finance Committee does as far as participating in the budget process is we are by law required to publish a 5-year projection. We're not very good at this. We're not very good at it because there are a lot of moving parts, okay? And I think probably the main reason why our projections in the past have not been close to reality is because we don't have a clear idea of the timing and the spending for large capital projects. And large capital projects we pay for with debt, okay? We're spending a lot of money on debt, actually. In fact, I just looked last night. In 2001, we were spending about $750,000 a year on debt service. In 2020, we are spending close to $7 million on debt service. Okay, so these are things that aren't part of the guideline process, and right now we don't forecast them. We don't have a good plan to say what's the timing of these expenditures so that we can in fact have a good projection and a good forecast of how that's gonna impact our property tax bill. And I think that's my last slide. Is that my last slide?
Yep.
That's it. So the three things are the guideline process, recommendations we make at town meeting, and our 5-year tax forecast. Okay, and I'll answer any questions we
Great,
have later.
I might point out that the Finance Committee is an entity authorized under state law, and that the moderator of Concord appoints 15 members to serve 2 to 3 years. As noted, and critical that you understand that the Finance Committee is a deliberative advisory and not a decision-making entity. And that becomes critical if you go to town meeting. The Finance Committee may recommend X, and the town meeting may vote Y, and the Finance Committee can't do anything about that. That's just the way the law is set up and the way the process works. The town meeting also has, and the town government has set up some guidelines, and there's one little booklet for those of you who care greatly about what's happening in Concord. There's this town committee handbook. Many of you may have seen it. It's quite complete. It tells you a lot about what's going on and how the committees, all committees, not just Finance Committee, are structured, a lot of the internal operating rules of the community. So if you don't have that book and you care about kind of how the town operates day in, day out, I highly recommend it to you. So
It's available at?
I assume it's available at the town hall, at the town hall.
I'm sure it's on the website.
Yeah. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mark Cost, who's been so kind to come over from a neighboring community in Westford. And Mark is on the board, is chairman of the Board of Selectmen, but he's also had a major role in the capital planning activities in that community that I believe he will tell you is growing rapidly. And for those of you who travel in that section, you will note that Westford's, at least in the main thoroughfares, has seen quite a significant growth. So with that,
Excuse me.
Mark?
Excuse
it's
me,
your-
Tommy, I pushed my
Yeah.
way in. I'm Todd Benjamin.
Oh, I hadn't noticed, please. This is Todd Benjamin, otherwise known as our friend Dory. Todd was to have been the person who commented, but Todd got sick yesterday, so another accolade to Dory.
Thank you, I am not Todd Benjamin, indeed. But I'm a member of the Town Government Committee, which helped to plan this forum. We're delighted to see so many of you. This has exceeded our expectation. And the reason we invited someone to speak on the idea of capital planning is that some of you may remember that at last year's town meeting, the League of Women Voters presented this statement on the handout that we had. And I'd just like to read it to you. And it's: the League of Women Voters urges the town and the schools to establish in 2019 a collaborative and comprehensive fiscal planning process for long-term capital spending, to study needs, costs, and financially prudent timing for large projects currently foreseen, considering the impact and tax burden on all town citizens. As a result of we pushed this, and so did the FinCom, pushed it, and the Select Board appointed this task force planning committee, planning committee task force rather, of which Todd Benjamin is the chair. And they are hard at work, this group, in coming up, and their timing is actually set up for later this spring, to come up with a recommendation for the town for the idea of how to go about planning and fitting into the whole process capital projects. What they are doing as part of that, which we are delighted about, is looking out at other communities and seeing how other communities do this. Concord may be the first, or maybe the second, we're not sure about that as far as the first towns in Concord in Massachusetts. But we're not the only town, and we can learn a great deal by looking out, and we are doing that. And so one of the towns that has a good example of a long time, 11-year, I believe, capital planning committee is Westford, our town of Westford. And so we reached out for Mark Cost, who, as Tom has identified, has been on this committee, I think, since the very beginning, and is now on the select board. I guess they've been approved as that, have they, are in process. And he is going to talk to us about how Westford manages its capital spending. This is just one example, but I hope will give us an idea. And this is all by way of saying that when the select board comes to discuss the recommendations later on this spring, I hope that you all will pay attention and be aware of this and participate in this very important study. As we've heard from Mary, these expenses are large, and we need to find the way to be in control. So Mark, thank you so much for coming to Concord to speak to us today.
Thank you. So I'm going to sit here, if it's okay, and just to make it more of a conversation as opposed to as a presentation. I do have to say at the outset that I have a favorite Concord resident. I don't know if anybody here knows David Bovair. Yes. So not only is he a great person, but he's the world's best chiropractor. So I've been going to Dave for probably 15 years. He's fantastic. So I know he's working right now and not able to watch, but maybe he'll watch at some point in time. So thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here. I think as Dory said, you know, this is just one type of process that's been successful for us. It was interesting to me when I began volunteering in Westford about 13 years ago that we did not have an approach to town finances that kind of mirrored how a well-run company would run its finances. And that includes understanding best practices. That somehow taxpayers expect something less from their elected officials than shareholders expect from their company's board. So one of the things that I heard this morning that was really interesting is that one of the things you're trying to do is to eliminate surprises. And I can tell you that our process, while it's not necessarily the best process, has eliminated any surprises as it relates to capital over the 11 years that we've been in place, and not just for the current year, I would say more importantly for the future years. So that's what I hope to share with you today, how we do our capital process, and if there's any learnings from it, that would be great. Next slide, please. So I kind of run these down through bullets. So if you wouldn't mind, yeah, that's perfect. So town manager Jody Ross came into town about the same time I started to volunteer, and one of the things that she recognized early on was that capital was a bit of a chaotic process. That departments spent as much time politicking for what it is that they needed, both in the current year and the future years, as they did trying to figure out all of the facts and figures behind what it is that they needed. So it was formed in 2008 in recognition of that and for better oversight. I've been chair of the committee since it was formed, so for the entire 11 years. Next, thank you. It should be noted that the members are appointed by Jody, by the town manager. The committee makes recommendations to her, and that the committee has no authority for how we finance the capital recommendations that we do. We're involved, but that's really up to the town manager, the finance director, and the finance committee. Membership's made up of some very important key stakeholders. This is one of the more important elements of how this works. So we have somebody from the select board of selectmen, which is myself. We have the school superintendent, a member from the school committee, the finance director, a member from the finance committee, a resident at large, which I think is something we've added within the last 2 or 3 years, which has become very important. The PTBC is a permanent town building committee. This is a hugely important element for what we do. They are maybe the hardest working volunteer committee that we have in town. The CPC, so our Community Preservation Committee, and somebody from our Recreation Commission. Non-voting attendees are also very important to this process. So at every meeting that we have, the town treasurer, who helps determine what is bondable and not, and whether it's excluded or not, and over how many years. And then our school finance director is also a member, but non-voting. And lastly, the process mirrors, as I said up front, how a well-run private company would manage their capital planning. Next slide, please. So, first bullet. So just by way of setting the stage for how much capital we have, Westford, we have over 150 miles of roadway requiring both below ground and above ground work. That's things like fleet and engineering and water infrastructure. We have 108 structures, which encompass about 1.3 million square feet of space. We have almost 225 vehicles, many of which are upwards of 20 years old and older. We have 23 different departments that require capital on a year-in and year-in basis. And we have, like I'm sure you do, numerous culverts, bridges, dams that are becoming very important. Consistently, and this has been from the beginning, we have well over $50 million worth of capital requests on a rolling 5-year basis. Obviously, we cannot afford to fund that each and every year. All funding sources are considered, but again, not decided by us. So everything from debt to CPC to enterprise funds to free cash, you name it, every source is considered when we're reviewing capital. And lastly, in the past 10 years, if you go to the next bullet, please, we've done these kinds of things with no surprises. We've funded a town hall expansion for nearly $4 million, our senior center expansion for $4 million, a new fire station on Boston Road for 12, a new town center building for 8. We've purchased an adjacent historic home in the center of town for potential use for a little less than $1 million. A future library expansion, which our portion would be about $12 million. Several MSBA projects for the schools, our portion of which was about $2.5 million, and our just recently completed historic Road and Bush Community Center project, which was for $7 million. So those have all been funded as well as normal operating capital. So how do we define capital? So this was one of the first things that we did 11 years ago. Again, there was not a definition that kind of fit the more traditional way a private company would look at capital. So we defined it as major non-recurring tangible assets and projects which are purchased or undertaken in intervals not less than 5 years, have a useful life of at least 5 years, and cost over $10,000. Items that are acquired by the technology department don't fit this, and they're still considered capital just because of the ever-changing nature of capital, or of technology. And we always agreed that if this definition didn't work for us, we would modify it. We've never modified it in 11 years because it has worked for us. All building-related projects over $50,000 must be reviewed by 2 very important committees in town, this Permanent Town Building Committee that I referenced, and we also have an Energy Committee. And the reason the Energy Committee needs to be referenced in each of our capital building projects is because if we're going to invest a lot of money in a building, we want to make sure it's as energy efficient as possible. This Energy Committee is made up of individuals who that's their expertise, and so we're not going to look as a capital committee at any building project that these 2 committees have not already previewed, reviewed, and supported. Before a project can be recommended, this is also something that we've implemented, particularly over the last 6 or 7 years, that we learned that before we're going to recommend a project, it's got to have a valid bid or a quote, right? So somebody can present a project, it may be worthwhile, but we're not going to guess at how much it is. So the requesting department has to come forward with a bid or a quote. We continue to refine those as we go through the process, but at least we have a starting point for something from a scope perspective, is something that we all align with. And lastly, details such as maintenance history, mileage, asset condition, things of that nature are all expected to be brought to us as we're reviewing projects. So just an example as it relates to a vehicle. Probably like you, we have a lot of people who want a lot of new vehicles, particularly the highway department, right? So having a nice new vehicle is interesting, but it's not necessarily necessary, especially if we know we can't afford them all. So we prioritize the vehicles based upon that information that's provided to us. So if a vehicle is wanted by the highway department and it's 8 years old, has very limited maintenance, but they want to kind of get onto this normal routine cycle of replacing their vehicles, it's never going to make the grade, right? We need to see some history that it's cost a lot of money in maintenance, it's had breakdown, it's affected their services, it has rust, how many miles does it have, and so on and so forth before we move forward with recommending it. So let me just describe what the process is. So 5-year capital submissions are integrated, very integrated into our annual department budget process, and due at the same time. So when the departments submit their budgets to Jody and the finance director for the beginning of their reviews. The capital 5-year submissions are also due at that time, and they come on, thank God that they've figured out how to use large sheets of paper, but every department submits requests that come into this. They're 5 years worth, every project is listed, and every project is initially prioritized by the requesting department. Next bullet, please. The committee meets roughly 8 to 10 times between September and November on Friday mornings for a couple of hours. They're open meetings. Maybe it's much like the finance committee, we don't tend to get a huge attendance, unless there's a couple of items that are of interest. But that's okay, we don't take it personally. And there's a schedule that we produce whereby each department is required during those 8 to 10 weeks to come and present their request. Each of those requests, as I mentioned, is prioritized by the department somewhere between 1 and 5, from most critical to least. And each project is labeled what it qualifies as. Is it safety related? Is it maintenance related? Is it regulatory related? What have you. Our final meeting in November includes what I call a straw person, which is developed by the chair, me, which really begins the deliberation process for what we're going to recommend. So we've got this, list of $50 million over a 5-year period. Somebody needs to start, based on all the meetings that we've had, what is a priority that may or may not fit with what the town's budget holds. So I do that. And I just start that. And everybody comes with their opinions, and we kind of modify that as we go. And then the last bullet, please. So that project list then gets voted on by the members of the committee. By the end of that last meeting, that's what goes to the town manager, that they then bring forward to the Board of Selectmen and the Finance Committee during a review that ultimately goes to town meeting. And then we have follow-on meetings in January and February, which is, if we've got follow-up items, we have a quote, but we didn't necessarily have a bid. Before it goes to town meeting, it must have a bid. So we then do follow-ups. So that when it gets to town meeting, the taxpayers understand that this isn't a number that's just kind of been pulled out of the sky. These are things that are pretty precise, or as precise as they can be. Next page, please. During the final meeting then, this is an important part of the process. So the town manager, the finance director, and the town treasurer, based on our long-term, so we do 20-year financial models. So we know over a 20-year period, based on debt fall-off schedules and assumptions on what's gonna happen with healthcare and our operating budgets, what we can expect from revenue, what we can afford. So based on those 20-year models and what the debt fall-off schedules are, we know what can be afforded. They bring that forward to the meetings. And it provides a guideline. So what we've done as a capital committee is decide, well, here's our priority list. They then come forward and say, well, based on all of the parameters over the next 20 years, here's what we can afford and prioritize. We then refine our priority list based on what they say that we can afford. And as I mentioned early on, it incorporates all of the various funding sources. So enterprise funds, so I don't know if you do, but we have an ambulance enterprise fund, we have recreation and water enterprise funds. All of those capital projects go through our process. The CPC and the CPA funds that are allotted are also considered this. They have their own process. So if we're counting on CPA funds for a particular project, we're obviously not going to bring it forward if the CPC hasn't already determined that it fits within their funding mechanisms. We have a capital stabilization fund that we created 11 years ago. So what is this? This is like the Finance Committee Reserve Fund. We've built it up to over $1 million. And it's used in cases where we have an emergency or a pressing need that the normal operating budget doesn't allow for. So how did we use that? We've only used it once, and we used it to acquire that historic home on Main Street adjacent to Town Center that was burnt in a fire. If any of you have been along Main Street in Westford, there was a beautiful old yellow coach house that burned down. The town purchased that as a potential for a town annex at some point in time before it got released to the public. And we used the capital stabilization fund to do it because it wasn't part of our normal capital process. Town has to approve the use of those stabilization funds. And then so since we used $700,000 for it, the commitment then was to rebuild those funds as part of our capital process. So we have to fund $250,000 over a 3-year period to rebuild the capital stabilization fund. Chapter 90 is also a part of that. And then, as I mentioned, projects get reprioritized based on that process. So my last page is just some keys to success. Thank you. So importantly, as I mentioned, it's fully integrated into our annual budgeting process. Next bullet, the capital definition is known by everybody. All other things that don't fall within capital go into operating. And there's been a couple of interesting points as it relates to that. So we used to have police vehicles and fire and police uniforms part of the capital process. Because they don't meet the capital definition, they are now part of our operating budgets. Now, there was a lot of pushback at first because that now means that free cash every year, or the general funds has to be used for those. But, you know, those have to be reviewed by the town manager. Those are not appropriate to be reviewed by a capital committee. It's not appropriate for us to determine when a firefighter needs new equipment, right? So those are things that if they're not known and not fit in the capital definition, they don't belong with us. Long-term financial models, as I mentioned, are updated all the time. We do 20-year projections, right? So even though our capital plan goes out 5 years, we know what the debt fallout schedules look like. And so if we can't afford a major capital project within the 5 years, we can plan for it. So the library is a perfect example, right? We have to wait for the state of library board of commissioners or whatever it is to approve a library expansion. You never know when that's going to happen, but we do know how much it's going to cost us. And so we can plan for it 7 years out. And if the town has prioritized that kind of project, then we put it 7 or 8 years out and know that that's using funds that we can't use for something else 7 or 8 or 9 years from now. The committee must be authorized, so our capital planning committee, it has to be authorized to set this process and supported by the town manager and by the finance director. It doesn't work if it reports to the town manager and the town manager does not support this process. The departments then must be prepared with their bids and quotes. This is something that's improved over the 11 years. I can tell you there may be 1% of the projects that come to us now during the fall planning process that don't come with those because they know we're not going to listen if they don't have it. And lastly, and really importantly, that if you look back at what the committee makeup was, they're there obviously to support their own departments. But more importantly, they're there to understand what other departments' needs are. They are not there as a voting member to say that I, as a school committee or as the school superintendent, am only going to push for mine. You force them to be well-rounded in what it is that they're supporting. They need to understand what the highway department needs, what the fire department needs, what other department needs are, so that when they're voting on behalf of the taxpayer, not on behalf of their individual department. So that's all I have at this point in time. So thank you very much for having me.
I think it's appropriate time for a quick break if anybody needs it. If not, we'll go to questions. And I would direct one to Mark to start with. If the fire department wants something special, can it go around behind you and go to the town manager? And why not?
Because she doesn't allow it. So and the same is true with the finance committee. So anything that is capital based on that definition, if somebody does it, wants it, everybody knows that they're not going to get it passed until the capital planning committee has reviewed it and supported it. If it's not supported, it doesn't. Now, the only The only time where I would say that gets violated is if the select board, sorry, I have a hard time
Yeah, we all do.
after 200 and some years being called the Board of Selectmen. Unless it is a priority that the Board of Selectmen has decided. So in Westford, I don't know about Concord, we don't have a lot of sidewalks. So the Pedestrian Safety Committee is pushing for sidewalks in Westford. That's part of our capital planning process. If the Board of Selectmen has decided that a sidewalk in a school zone is a priority for them, they have to say to us that that is a safety priority for them. And once they make that statement, then we make sure that we fit it in the priorities. But other than that, no, it doesn't happen.
Great, thank you.
It did early on, but it doesn't happen.
Yeah, this is the key.
So do we have any questions? Yes, Ruth?
Vis-a-vis the capital planning, how long is an item likely to be in the pipeline before you actually make a recommendation for an appropriation?
So we've had.
Did everybody hear the question?
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, so we've had items on our 5-year rolling capital plan that have never been approved or recommended. For a variety of reasons. Either it never makes the cut as a priority relative to the funding sources, or there hasn't been a case provided that makes it a priority. I'm just trying to think of some examples. So, it eventually got funded, but it took about 8 years. New bleachers for the football stadium. The bleachers for the football stadium in and of itself wasn't necessarily a problem, but once we changed, because we didn't have handicap accessibility in our home bleachers. We still don't have visitor bleachers. We don't want visitors showing up. Because we lose all the time, so why would we want them to show up? I'm just kidding. But what it triggered, because it was a major expansion and now it had handicap accessibility, all the other requirements on the facility needed to get changed.
Right.
New bathrooms, right? Right now, we pretty much have porta potties. A larger space for where the food service happens, right? So that all brought with it another $5, $6, $7 million worth of a project. And so we were like, the project isn't the bleachers. The project is the football stadium. So until all the other stuff could be afforded with the bleachers, we couldn't do it. So,
Well, for instance, your town buildings that
Yeah.
you gave us a price tag on, how long were they something that's actually done and actually a large number? How long were the large number items?
so because as you know, the building ones take a long time to plan and get approved by the various regulatory elements, not just the town. We start with feasibility studies. So the feasibility study, which also has to go through capital, does not get approved if 3 years from now or 4 years from now, we know we can't afford what the potential capital for that is, right? So it's kind of this, we follow the capital from the beginning to its end. If the feasibility study is something that is a priority for the town, and we know that it's a 7-year process, we'll put it in the 20-year financial model 7 years hence and approve the feasibility study. But its next stage doesn't get approved until the results of the feasibility study happen. So it gets approved at each stage, not as a whole process. So we don't approve, like the fire station, we didn't approve the $12 million plus all the feasibility stuff all at once. That happened in stages. And if we spent $200,000 for a feasibility study, and at the end of the day, it cost too much, and we ended up wasting $200,000, well, it's better to waste $200,000 than $15 million that you can't afford. So.
Yes.
Thank you. Stephen, this is a question directed to you. It's a tiny little thing, but you talked about investment income. That was a line on the charts that you demonstrated. And I'm thinking about funding money that hasn't been spent. CPC gave some money, that wasn't, that is over time going to be spent, but was not spent when it was originally given. I'm thinking of the Junction Village money that was voted on by the town and has been sitting, I don't know where. So my question is, that comes to a couple of $1 million, when you kind of look at it in its aggregate, and I'm just naming a couple of items. How is that invested? And where do we show the growth of that capital?
So I don't know where Concord invests its money. That would be something Kerry, this is where the poor substitute thing comes in. But I know generally municipalities, you know, we can't just go like day trade with, you know, there are restrictions on what you can do. Generally, I know, I'll give you the answer for Long Meadow, we would just do CDs.
Okay.
So low risk, low yield. So there isn't tons of money that gets generated from interest, but some, and it is income to the general fund, you have to report that, but it's usually very low yield, very low risk.
But the interest goes to the general fund.
Correct.
Good.
And that's by law. I mean, you can't be more
yeah,
aggressive in that investment in order to, I mean, with that $1 million sitting there for now almost 3 years, or two, I'm just talking now, just like the Junction Village money.
Yep.
I mean, if that had been invested over a 2 to 3 year period, that would have accrued some, you know, some, I suspect,
Yeah, Joe,
considerable growth.
Yeah, but I think it's we have to separate from, and I'm kind of
by
going
law,
out on
that's-
I'm going on a little bit of a limb here, but it's not like we take the appropriation of $1 million and stash it away.
Right.
It's the appropriation exists as a legislative decision. The town's reserves generally exist as, you know, as a sum of money, but we don't take the $1 million for that project and stick it in its own account reserving for that project. It's you know, the money's
It's in the
there
pipeline,
globally when we're ready to spend it.
So in the abstract, it's there.
In the yeah, I mean it's
It's there,
Yeah.
it's just not gonna.
Thank you.
yes, I won't say lockbox, you know.
Mary may be able to add, can you add anything to that
No,
discussion?
no.
Okay.
Well, thank
All
you
right.
for that.
Good,
I
thank you,
appreciate it.
thank you.
Terry?
A couple of questions. First of all, I'm surprised in the meeting of the League of Women Voters of all things that we have a restriction to just questions. This is a democratic process that we have in town, and we should have comments as well as questions. We went through a period 5 years ago where our hearings only allowed questions. So many of us learned how to ask questions that were comments. Second thing is, I'm pleased to hear the Finance Committee emphasizing today that it is an advisory board. Some of the suggestions that the Finance Committee has had in the last year has suggested something more dramatic than that. So I have first question. The Finance Committee has targeted the new sustainable index to the lower 20% of our incomes in town. Were the existing mechanisms, tax aids, one of them is tax relief fund. The second is our legislation allowing for senior tax exemptions. Were those, and those were targeted at this 20% as well. Were those considered when you chose to focus this new program on the lower 20%?
Mary, can you answer that?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. What was targeted to the lower 20%?
Your sustainable index was trying to get the tax rate down so that we could keep the 20% lower incomes in town, in
No.
town.
No,
Oh, I've heard that.
no, this
Who are
is,
you trying to help then?
this, everyone really. Well, we're not trying to help anyone, we're just trying to educate people that this is how costs are going up overall in the economy, in the market, and here's where our costs are going up. So it wasn't targeted, it's not a targeted program, it's simply a guideline number out there to say, this is how costs are going up overall in the market, here's how our costs are going up, and it really is, so, I'll stop. It's not a program, it's really just a guide, it's
Well, that's a-
information.
That's a change from my impressions to date.
It's all right. It's all right, it's not a.
Second question is, we used to compare our growth rate in taxes to our neighboring towns to see if there's something really bad going on in Concord. Why don't we use that standard anymore in the guidelines process?
I think that's a good question, and we didn't do that. And it's funny you should say, I don't know why. And that was something that we probably should look at. But I will say that even if everyone else's taxes are going up much higher than the CPI, we might be onto something that other towns would benefit from looking at as well.
And what does the CPI tell us about the sustainable rate for the next year or 5 years? What level is that?
Well, we could debate about how to calculate it.
Well, what are you using today? You're using,
Today, we defined how to calculate the sustainable growth rate, and right now, the number is 2.16%.
okay, do you ever think about the contrast of the 2.16% to a thing called Proposition 2.5, and that your Concord's target is even lower than that kind of number?
There are two numbers out there. Yes, there's 2.5%, Prop 2.5, and then there's the sustainable growth rate,
And
yes.
if that sustainable rate is used to keep down the collective bargaining in Concord, keep down the collective bargaining flexibility, did the Finance Committee consider how town employees could increase their real income over time?
I'm sorry, I don't
I
understand.
think the answer,
don't
when I was on the finance committee, the answer to that would be no.
Okay, no.
I haven't been on it for a year or so, Mary. It would have been no, because the identification of the sustainable growth is a general number, not targeted to specific interest groups in the community. So the answer
But
to your question would have been no.
I will say, though, that in the past, the collective bargaining agreements with some of our town employees have been a lot higher than our sustainable growth rate or the Prop 2.5 number. It's been more in the 4 to 5% range. So if your concern is that this is being used to hold back, maybe it should be held back a little bit, because I think 4 to 5% is quite generous.
Well, put it in the 3%, and then we got some real growth there.
That's up for the negotiating
And that's where
parties
we've been
to-
most of the time.
Well, no, but, I'm sorry,
Yeah, sorry.
we should move on.
My question is for the town manager.
Can you speak up again?
Sorry. For the town manager, this land manager
Mhm.
who's going to be new, could you speak more to the relationship with other current land management activities, and will a citizen be able to lobby this person to cut some of our grass that's down the side of the road and so forth?
So the land manager, and again, it has been talked about for quite a while. I don't. It was a request from the Division of Planning and Land Management. I will confess that I have not observed a job description, but I do know the need is real and the need is there. In fact, I discussed this with is that the Concord Conservancy? The Land Trust.
CLCT?
Yeah, the Land Trust. I discussed, and they have the same types of issues, and it really is more of a trail maintenance type position, not like roadway maintenance. It's, we have a lot of, like I said, if we have a town, open space or conservation parcel, and a tree falls over and is blocking a trail, it would be handling that. I'm sure some grass cutting, if there's parking areas that are used to access, conservation or open space, making sure that the parking areas are maintained. This person is going to be the kind of overseer of the tree bylaw. Right now, one of the reasons we were able to offset the total cost impact of the land manager is that the building inspectors voluntarily gave up the stipend or the money that they get to do the tree bylaw. They don't. It's not really. It's kind of a square peg round hole duty for a building inspector. So that's one specific duty that I think is going to be in there. The rest of it, I think, to be honest with you, we're going to.
So it's in NRC.
Yeah. Yes. But
Yes.
I'm sorry. If you have concerns about maintenance anywhere, you can certainly forward them to me, and I'll see to it that the appropriate department takes care of it. Though, you can do that, and you can do that today.
You may regret that. Yes.
Hi, I'm not quite sure who my question is for, so perhaps anyone who feels it speaks to them could respond. But what I'm wondering about, thinking about your capital planning process and then knowing that we are thinking about doing this in Concord, and I know you said that the public doesn't come to your meetings, although they are open meetings necessarily, but you did mention things that there might be times where people would come sometimes if there's an article of interest, and.
Sorry, not just an article,
Oh,
anything of interest.
anything of interest, and do your meetings include a period where people can express that
Of course.
interest, or do they just show up?
Of course.
Okay.
So I
Thank
don't
you.
have open meeting comments when I look out the audience and I see nothing but blank chairs.
Right.
Which is 90% of the time.
Sure.
But yeah, oh, absolutely. So,
Okay.
I would say one of the things that I like about what's happened over the last 11 years for all of our committees is they are free and open. So we do provide, up to the chair's discretion, how much public comment we get during a meeting so we can continue on with business, but absolutely, if somebody comes, we tend to get most of it with the sidewalk issue, to be honest. The
That
public
would be my
safety
guess,
stuff,
yes.
if you live on a road, a narrow road that does not have sidewalks, and the Public Safety Commission has asked for sidewalks, you can bet we'll have
Yes.
a few.
Stephen.
So I just want to follow up on a point though, because, and I don't know if anybody's going to ask this, but the capital planning process in Westford, where I actually am one of Mark's constituents, it's good to get to know. Is very detailed. It's actually very similar to one I had as manager in Long Meadow. We have a capital planning task force that is kind of working on this question. The one thing I want to say is many of the steps in the process happen in Concord. There's just not a committee. It happens at the administrative level where department heads work on their capital plans. I have on my desk the FY19 capital plan, and it is chock full of information, debt schedules, detailed information with the projects, estimated costs. I mean, it's all there. I think one of the things that I now observe as the new guy as a disconnect is it wasn't evident to the community that level of detail and process goes into the preparation of the capital plan. But it's definitely there. I mean, as in our task force meeting, I said, I think Hugh made the comment that we don't have a process, and I said, well, the town clearly has been developing, conceiving, developing, proposing, and executing capital projects forever. So there is clearly some kind of process that happens. I think one of the things, like I said, is an area of focus for us going forward is being able to articulate it in a more detailed way, like Mark just did, and I think that's something that I've engaged the task force on.
Mary?
I have a question. Mark, when you said that
Speak up.
you have a process at the end where the town manager and the finance director get together and they filter all this into what's affordable, right?
Yes,
How do you
so-
determine what's affordable?
Right, so that's part of the reason why the 20-year model is really important.
Uh-huh.
So, projecting after a whole series of assumptions, what's available in the operating funds for capital.
Mhm.
And then based on a debt fall-off
Right.
schedule, because our commitment is for non-excluded debt, that we only replace what's there today. So the fall-off schedule is important in that we're not trying to add to the non-excluded debt, right? We have a certain level between principal and interest that we are not trying to grow that, right? People don't need to be paid more for that. So then there's the excluded debt.
Right,
That tends to be the
right.
larger buildings and so
Right.
forth, as you know. Those are also on a fall-off schedule, so that when the taxpayer asks us, what's the increment to our total tax bill by us moving forward with an excluded debt item?
Right.
We can say it's not incremental because it's replacing something that's falling off, or it's incremental and it's an extra 35 cents to everybody's tax roll.
Okay.
But it requires that level of assessment. And then it requires an assessment of what funds are available in the enterprise funds and all of the other things. So ambulance enterprise, ambulance may need a new, the ambulance department may need a new ambulance. We only fund ambulances out of the enterprise fund. So if they don't have enough revenue in their enterprise fund to fund a new ambulance, unless it's in a complete emergency, they don't get a new ambulance.
Okay.
Lady behind Julie.
I wanted to ask, I feel one of the deficiencies of the current Concord Capital Task Force is the fact that it's not a permanent committee, and its members are only, have a term of 6 months. And I wanted to ask Mr. Koss what the term of office is of your capital planning committee.
So, again, they're appointed by the town manager. They're 1-year terms, but they don't get replaced unless somebody says, I'm not interested in doing it. So, or somebody's not performing, you know, the task, in which case Jody can make that change on her own. Of the 9 members, 8 have been there for most of the 11 years.
I mean, that I feel is a deficiency of not having
You need consistency.
consistency and a long-term memory.
Yeah, you do, because we do get, one of the first things we do at the beginning of the process is we review capital projects from the past and where they stand in their completion, and whether there are funds left over that the town manager and the finance director should bring to special town meeting, which we always have in October. Apparently they're not special anymore because they happen all the time, to reappropriate. So,
Dory?
Yeah, I'd just like to qualify, I think that maybe I didn't make this clear at the beginning. The task force is not the committee. The task force is what the select board set up in spring of 2019 and has actually started now, was slow in getting off, is to design what we're gonna do. It might be a committee, it might be a lottery, you know, it could be, voting, you know, it could be anything, but I'm kidding. But their charge is to suggest, what do you want Concord to do to address capital planning? They are not the body that's going to do it.
And who will make the decision?
The select board, I assume, will make the decision, since the select board and the town manager, the select board was the appointing authority, D.
Lady to my left.
Hi, my question is addressed to Mark. Mark, do you, with your high-end capital projects, do you set up stabilization funds?
yeah, so we have one capital stabilization fund that we didn't have before, but we do now, which, as I mentioned earlier, we've only used once, and that was to buy that historic home on Main Street. But it's there for things like that.
Mark, on the assumption that somebody in here, in addition to myself, doesn't fully understand stabilization fund, could you just make a
Yeah,
comment?
so it's a bit like a reserve fund that the finance committee has, although yours is, I think you mentioned 2.25.
Yeah.
225,000, that's about what Westford's is too. But it's there, I don't think I want to call it a rainy day fund, but in essence, it's like that. Something comes up in the middle of the year where the town believes it needs to use capital for. It wants to use it, and so what it has to do, so as part of the capital planning process, we'll build up that fund up to a maximum amount, which was around 1.2 million. To use it, the town also has to authorize it. Okay, so just because it's there doesn't mean the town manager or anybody else can use it. So then the taxpayer then has to vote to release funds from the capitalization fund. But but it's there, it's been built up, and it's there in reserve.
Just
Yes.
a brief follow-on, do you ever, or have you ever considered earmarking a stabilization fund to benefit for a specific project?
No.
Which then would reduce the tax burden?
No,
You have
so
not.
it's not, because if we can't afford it as a part of the normal cash process, and it doesn't make a priority list, then it won't, we're not gonna use stabilization funds for that. It is only meant for things that, have come up that were not planned for.
Okay.
Stephen would like to comment.
Yeah,
as
so,
well.
so I know what she's talking about. Part of the warrant will include a middle school stabilization fund, for those of you who aren't aware. And tying back to one of the things Mark said, and capital stabilization is also good if, you know, you do the best job you can with due diligence on bids, but the cost of the project isn't your estimate, the cost of the project is the bid. And a lot of times that isn't known, not every time it's not known to actually go out to bid. So capital stabilization funds can also be used by a special town meeting. So if you have a big project, if the bid comes in despite your best efforts over the appropriation, you can use it. So Mark talks about the debt schedule. And I know Carrie, if Carrie was here, she'd probably have a slide that shows the debt schedule. And we've done some projections with the middle school.
Right.
Like I said, the capital plan has those, you know, every year, you know, going out the next 5 years or more, I think. So obviously, if the middle school were approved by voters this fall, it would look like a peak in the debt service. But because the elementary school projects are falling off, it levels out. And so the stabilization fund is a way to use, I think, free cash in this case,
Right.
to soften that peak in that 1 year and make it so it's more of a rounder curve than a spike in one given tax year. So that is a way. I mean, you wouldn't do that for a small, you know, $2 million project, but for 90 to 100, it does make sense. So that's what she's talking about there.
Yeah, and we don't use stabilization in that way, you certainly could.
Yeah.
Right,
I mean, it's up to
we're
the
talking,
town to do
I
that.
think we're talking different things. One is a stabilization fund for a specific project,
Right.
and this is an ongoing stabilization fund.
So, yeah, so we're talking about a stabilization fund that's project specific.
Right.
Again, there aren't many projects that would really justify or necessitate the need for a project specific stabilization fund. But what Mark is talking about, and Long Meadow had one as well, a capital stabilization fund that is basically a buffer for unforeseen capital projects, because stuff happens, things fail in the middle of a year, you may have a roof collapse under snow or something like that, and you know, your insurance may only pay for part of it, and or costs of projects that were higher than estimated, but when the money was appropriated.
Gentleman in the rear.
We may have one of those too.
Sorry, sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you. Your
Hard to hear you.
the point about bids and costs and estimates, in Westford, did you find that you got worse bids from vendors who were tired of providing bids every year for something that they knew wouldn't happen for 6 years? Or did you get more accurate results, or did the purchasing department complain that was too much paperwork to comply with?
Yeah, well, no, so we don't, I have no sympathy for somebody who says they don't want to do it because it takes too much time. So that whole, the purchasing department is our town manager and our assistant town manager. I don't have a lot of empathy or sympathy for that excuse. But one of the reasons we break projects down into bites is for that exact reason. So we don't require a bid on like a $7 million project at the beginning. We require the bid on the feasibility study that's gonna happen if it gets approved sometime in the next 6 to 12 months. The estimate then is just that. That just gives us a flavor for, it's $250,000 for the feasibility study, the total project could be $7 million. So that when we plan out our capital, we're putting $7 million or $6.7 million into future years. As we get to the next one, so you go from feasibility to design, and then there's various stages of design, we only appropriate that next step. We don't appropriate $7 million up front. So by the time we get to the big money, which is the actual building, we are then talking about something that's going to start in the next year, and so we don't have that issue. That's an important change. It's a good point that we've made through this process. We used to do, you know, it was $7 million, let's appropriate it now, and then by the time you get to it, it's 7 is 10. You know, it's local version of big dig. We don't go through that now.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This is a more theoretical question, but again, I think an
I'm
important
better with
one.
theory.
The strong town manager model that we have in Concord, so this is a two-part question. Mark, do you have a strong town manager model
So,
in Westford?
What does that mean to you, just so I know?
Well,
She's very tough, if that's what you mean.
Well, yeah, and she does like.
Yeah, she's
on
in
the
shape,
side.
yeah, she does all that stuff.
I think that it has meant in Concord that a great deal of the organization, momentum, future visioning has rested in the role of the town manager.
Yes.
And that's not necessarily a specifically accurate definition, but in the overall presentation, I think it's not inaccurate. So is
Yeah.
that an expectation in Westford?
So, let me just say this, the town manager, works for the Board of Selectmen.
Okay,
So at the end of the day, the select board is responsible for the policies of the town
of the town,
and the will of the town. So she works for us.
for us as opposed to.
Yes, so, but that being said,
Yes.
because of, you have to have confidence in your town manager, and I'm sure you do, you rest a lot of your, obviously, day-to-day, month-to-month processes. But it has to be very interactive, right? So the town manager can't just, she will always bring something that she believes is a reset of a policy or a change to the select board before she would ever implement it. Or bring it in front of the finance committee if it involves a change in, some financial process. So I would say it's very collaborative. You have to have a strong town manager just to deal with what they deal with every day. I've said there is not a chance in the world that my personality could do what they do. It's just, right, some people are meant to do it and some people, but, so I do think has to be very.
From a chart, I think the
Yeah,
form
so-
of government is a strong town manager form of government in Westford. Jody is the appointing authority, she prepares the budget, so from a structural standpoint, it's
From
similar.
the structural standpoint. So you feel that your operation is collaborative with the town manager on
Oh.
an ongoing and continuous basis?
Not only with the town manager, but between departments.
Thank you.
Way in the beard, yes.
Let me try to build on Terry Rothmel's, if I can. As far as I can see, there is an elephant in the room, one that until recent times, it was considered unacceptable even to bring up in public. That's the very great wealth disparity across American society, extreme wealth disparity. Concord, we are, of course, a wealthy town, very obviously, rightfully. But within Concord, these same sort of stratifications exist. Terry mentioned 20%. There's some discussion about whether it's 20% or whether it's a third, but there is extreme differentiation inside Concord, such that lower, let's say, quintile is potentially seriously damaged by increases in the tax rate. And I think that's the sort of thing Terry was referencing. He mentioned the various mechanisms that have been instituted in town to try to deal with this. Let me go to what now really is a radical notion. but-
Could I ask, do you have a question?
As Terry said, some of these questions become comments.
You and I know each other, so I'm asking you, do you have a question?
Well, it will be whether or not you want to go there, but I've got to describe it
Just-
before you can get to
All right,
it.
just remember the time limitations that we have, my friend.
Thank you, my friend.
The right honorable gentleman.
The radical proposal is that we have differential property taxes. We're going to fund the town based on property taxes. which is,
No.
On paper, but not in.
It's been pretty well established. To do that would require a change in the Commonwealth Constitution. is a very large step. I suppose that's what citizens may say radical. But if we were able to go there, instead of potentially damaging this lower quintile and some others, by goodness sakes, we'd stop having this very great pain. Will the town, represented by a couple of the parties on the panel today, consider such a thing?
So,
Would you like to attack that,
Oh.
Mr. New Town Manager?
sure, we do have abatement, you know, we do have a tax, it's not really abatement program, but it's a senior tax, discount, I don't remember, actually,
Exemption.
assistance, yeah, and actually, the original warrant article, which was before my time, had a sunset date, I think, of this year, and it turns out you have to go back to the legislature to get it extended, so there was gonna be an article in the warrant to send that off, to make that permanent. I think this, you know, I'll be candid and say that this is an issue, in many communities in the Commonwealth, especially, places like Concord that do have high property values and an aging population. There's this, a lot of discussion around aging in place. In addition to the tax relief, Concord does have a council on aging that provides great services. You know, there are a lot of opportunities out there for people who, you know, may be struggling a bit to get assistance in a not only in their tax bill, but with food or with utility costs. I mean, there's a lot out there. I will say that one of the greatest barriers to people accessing those services is often pride, and that's something that we really kind of struggle to help people overcome. But this idea about aging in place vis-a-vis your tax bill is something a lot of communities struggle with, and I think the unfortunate, honest answer is that it just may not be in the cards for everybody to stay in their home long term because of other members of the community making spending decisions and making investments that they want to see in their town. And like I said, I don't have a great answer for you as to like what the magic wand we can wave to fix that is. I think we are talking every day about trying to create housing opportunities for people that are more affordable. Not only affordable housing as that's, you know, Junction Village context, but also whole life housing. So there's a market opportunity for people who maybe want to downsize, get a smaller place, smaller tax bill. But it is a really, really challenging and complex problem, and that's why I don't have a great answer for you.
So can I?
I have to say how appreciative I am of that frank assessment of the situation. Let me notice that while it might to some seem like a magic wand to move toward a amendment to the Commonwealth Constitution so that we could have differential property taxes, the journeys of 1,000 miles begin with the first step, and particularly with political will and commitment to do so.
So can I just offer
Yeah,
one thing as it relates to
please.
that? So obviously Westford struggles with this as well. About a year and a half ago, to the extent that you're interested, you can talk to Jody about it if you'd like. We formed a committee called the Slider Committee.
The what?
Slider.
Slide.
It's a horrible acronym, but it's
Really?
Senior, Low Income, and Disabled Tax Relief. SLIDTR. And it's, so I was on it, another select board member who was on it. The Council on Aging was very much involved with it, and it was about expanding what is typically a senior-only tax deferral relief program to encompass all of those groups. And it's based on a whole set of parameters, and it took a long time. It's also with, it has been recently approved by the state. So I don't know how yours does or doesn't differ from that, but to the extent that you're interested.
Yours is a deferral program?
No, it's a relief.
It is an exemption,
Yeah,
okay,
it's an
okay.
exemption.
I thought I heard deferral.
Yeah, but it's
Okay.
based on age and income and so on.
Got it.
Question here. You.
Hi, how do we handle, or do we have a mechanism for handling, and I think maybe you're doing that in Westford, overall system viewpoints for investments in things that, for example, reduce costs that would otherwise everybody would pay. The classic thing being climate change costs. And What about different departments where you have to invest, a raising in cost of the investment in one department benefits a different department? How do you balance those savings? And I can give you a couple of examples. Suppose that we built a net zero middle school that had industrial electric storage. That would benefit the entire town, but it wouldn't benefit the school itself at all. It would increase the school building budget, but it would overall save us a lot of money. How do we do that sort of thing? Also, how do we,
This is one of those speeches wrapped in questions.
Yeah, I'm getting that.
how do we get the overall view, like you do in your household budget, where you pay taxes that overall increases the benefit for everybody, but not each individual person doesn't benefit. In fact, it hurts each individual person. It's only.
So,
It-
can
okay,
we,
So there's the externalized cost that you can say,
Right.
what's the cost of not doing it?
Steve, would you
Yes.
like to begin that?
Sure, I would love that.
Great.
So the key issue, the key word there is balance, and you're 100% right. You have to balance the needs. How I,
Who does that?
well, the town administration takes the first pass at it. The town manager's budget is the first pass at it. The select board then looks at it and sees if it meets their priorities and balances out what they view to be the priorities for the town. And then ultimately, friends and neighbors at town meeting make those ultimate decisions. So I think in terms of how does that happen, how does as town manager, how do I do that? The answer is, first of all, the overall goal, I think I would say it a different way. I would say the overall goal that we do in public service is the greatest good for the greatest number. That is what our primary charge is. And then really trying to find resources to take care of needs that aren't met by that greatest good for the greatest number threshold. When you're preparing the annual budget, how you do that kind of counterintuitively is line by line. And so you look at what are the costs for each thing and how are we using it, what is that service needed, and then you pull back and look at the overall picture. What is the overall impact to the taxpayer? What is the overall impact to service level? And then the other thing is, and I'm glad you brought it up, what areas are things that we can regionalize? What areas are things that we can share amongst departments? How do we get the greatest value out of each expenditure? I somewhat say, people say zero-based budgeting, I always call it value-based budgeting. Are we getting great value? I think the school building project is, the energy storage at the school is a good example. One of the investments that the town has made, and she just left, darn it all, is investing in a sustainability coordinator to make sure that we're always looking towards saving money and also having a positive climate impact.
just know I got one simple question. How are FinCom members can they serve on other town committees? The answer is no. A member, this is from some of the regulations, a member of the Finance Committee cannot, quote, be elected or appointed to any other town offices, end quote. Some exceptions, but in general, the answer is no.
So Tom, can I also
Yeah,
address?
absolutely.
In Westford, the capital planning committee is agnostic to departments. Right, we don't make recommendations based upon how it affects one department we make decisions or recommendations based on its effect to the taxpayer. The focus is always the taxpayer. If there's a negative impact to a particular department and it's based on the better good for the taxpayer, then that department's budget will get increased by the amount that it's negatively affected, but the part that gets positively affected will be reduced. So that's just the overall goal. As it relates to energy efficiency and things of that nature, we review that as a part of the capital. So if somebody's going to put a $150,000 new boiler in a school, it has to meet energy efficiency requirements. And if it costs more than a non-energy efficient requirement, then we go through force the school committee to show us the payback of that particular capital investment, spending a little bit more now, but getting better savings long term.
Dory?
What
Yep.
about building a school that saves the transportation department money?
So we don't have a transportation department.
Or whatever.
Yeah, so, but in theory, it would work the same way. If, at the end of the day, the school is necessary and there's other costs you want to put into the school to save something else, if those costs are going to the school committee, then we would put more costs in the school budget and we would take them away from whichever department or departments are benefiting.
Can I help for a minute? Dory, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I had a quick question, is that
Go
right?
ahead. Yes.
I noticed in the charge of Concord for the capital planning task force, it talks about for very large projects. And large was in the League of Women Voters coming in. Large can be defined as what I think of as large and what you think of as large. I noticed that for Westford, it's everything over $10,000. And I'm wondering if how that works and how that was arrived at such a difference.
Yes.
10,000 and very large. I'm thinking very large means not just $1 million, we do that every day here, not even $10 million, but bigger than that. And so if Concord is thinking in terms of that, I will be disappointed, frankly. That's my speech. But the question is, how does Concord look at it?
So I want to I want to kind of break off the thing. The capital planning task force is looking at very large projects because that was the charge. I think that's the overall community concern is the big stuff. And I wasn't here when the charge was written.
No, I
there
know.
seemed to be less concern with the smaller stuff.
Define small.
Like you said, under $1 million.
Oh, okay.
So like there was less concern about reviewing requests for vehicles and things like that. This is just the impression I get, Dory. I wasn't here when all this was written, but the focus isn't on vehicle replacements or the boilers. I mean, the Concord I think has some faith that the administration and the select board are doing their work before it gets to town meeting. Defining very large project is one of the things we are currently working on at the task force. So I think that's going to take a while, but because some of it is very large financially, some of it is very large politically, and we're trying to find a way to bridge that. So, but to belabor the point, the 10,000 towns do it either 10,000 or 25,000, a use life of 3 years or 5 years. I mean, there's different ways to do it, but capital items have a pretty standard definition across most municipalities, and so what he was talking about was that standard definition. I think 10's too low because those definitions were written when you could get something for $10,000, but that's the definition.
So like I said, the reason that we did choose 10 and we still stick with it, doesn't take a lot of $15,000 or $20,000 items.
Yeah,
so
they do get that.
To suck up $100,000, $150,000, $200,000. So it's whether we spend a lot of time on a $15,000 item is secondary, because we typically won't, right? But we want departments to understand that whether we can afford their particular $15,000 item is completely a function of what the other priorities of capital are. And if we are down to that last 100 and somebody wants, this isn't the case, but if somebody wanted a new set of office furniture, it ain't happening, right? Because it's not that's why we stay.
I was instructed quite directly by my friend here. The meeting is about to adjourn at 11:15 unless there are questions that people wish to ask, and I see some hands. So we'll go from here.
Thank you. And this is for Mark. Mark, when your capital planning committee was set up, did it have all of the members on it that you showed on your screen?
With the exception of the resident at large, that we added 3 years ago.
And what do you think has been the benefit and value of having all of these various constituencies represented?
So we find that the benefit is related to everybody understanding what everybody else's needs are. So the best example is most of the time is between the schools and most other departments, right? The schools, like I'm sure it does here.
Yes.
sucks up the majority of the capital, has the most buildings generally, and the most square footage certainly. And had they not known what the priorities of other departments would be, would advocate mostly for what they need, of course. However, when the schools understand that the highway department has a 25-year-old snowplow that's rusting, we're spending $15,000 a year in maintenance, and we can't afford to replace it, therefore the roads for the children to get to school can't be plowed, all of a sudden they go, all right, well, we need to spend $250,000 on a replacement plow, and that is more important than whatever they may have. It just it's part of this integration of being one town, one set of departments, everybody understanding what everybody's kind of tough points are, and it goes the other way too, right? The highway department may be advocating for the 250 vehicle, but understanding that the schools need a new boiler because the boiler is 45 years old. We're spending a lot of money on the boiler, and so I can get another year out of my truck, and I'd rather the schools do it. And so you kind of get that knowledge that absent the committee, at least in Westford, you never got. You had one person making that, and that's where the politicking comes in.
Ingrid, you have a question?
Specific
Yeah.
example, though.
No,
Yeah.
well, no,
Wait a minute,
no.
wait a minute, please.
Would
Miss,
it not replace fossil
Pamela.
fuels?
Miss,
Would
please.
it
Pamela.
Change it to electric, which is the
Well,
overall goal.
well, so it isn't the goal for us, for example, with energy efficiency, isn't going from fossil fuels to electric. It's this because it's the combination of where the cost benefit analysis with what the town deems relevant for it, so I can't speak for Concord, what it wants out of fossil fuels or not. So we apply for green community grants every year. I think we've gotten almost $2 million worth of green community grants over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, something like that. So we tend, if we can't afford it in the budget, so grants are, I didn't mention it up here, but it's actually very important to the capital process as well. If we feel something like that would allow us to get a grant, we would do it. But it's everything. So we don't have an exclusion for, well, we want to be a greener community, therefore we're willing to pay $1 million more for it. That's not for the committee to decide. It's up to the taxpayer to decide. We provide those alternatives when we're going through the capital planning process.
Ingrid?
So how do you communicate what you're doing to the voters of Westford? So they understand and know where you fit into the budget review and planning process?
So it took a lot of years, but pretty much anybody who's interested in knowing about the budget process in Westford, which I don't know what percentage it is, maybe it's less than it should be, let's put it that way.
I'm not in it.
But the ones who are interested are very vocal. They know what that process is. As I said, they're welcome to come to the capital planning committee meetings. Most of them don't. There's enough trust now in that committee and what the recommendations are that when it comes to town meeting, they know that everything's been vetted appropriately. And one thing I'll say about town meeting and I don't get up and make a presentation at town meeting on capital. I refuse to right from the beginning. Why? Because we've kind of prioritized what we recommend, but the highway department superintendent or the school superintendent or whomever, if somebody asks a question about their project, they're the department head, right? I'm not speaking on their behalf. They need to speak on their behalf why they felt it important enough to come to us. If somebody asked me a question, how did we prioritize it or why, or what lease versus buy decisions did we analyze, like all that stuff, I'm happy to do that. But it's not for me to say that they need a snowplow because of A, B, and C. I'm not the resident expert.
No, but you've said you represent the taxpayer. That is the mindset of your committee.
Correct.
And so how do you let the taxpayer know? Do you have a written report?
Yes.
So where does that? Do people get it in
Yeah,
their
so-
mailboxes? How does
No,
that
so
happen?
what happens is in our budget review process, every department comes and reviews their recommended budget in front of the finance committee and board of selectmen. As our capital, I have to make a presentation of what we're recommending for capital to that same group. In January, I think it's the last Thursday in January this year, I'll be making our capital recommendation presentation to it. And within that presentation, I talk about all the things that were asked for, why we prioritized what we did, why they've been put into financing buckets by the town manager and finance director. So that's the first. If they didn't come to a meeting, that's the first view. And then you guys probably do it too. There's an annual, the finance committee, two things. The finance committee prepares a book ahead of the town meeting.
Correct.
Capital has its own section.
Yep.
And then in the annual report that the town does, we're also in there, and it's also.
But that's a retrospective.
That's retrospective, yes, but the finance committee book is
Excuse me, Mark.
prospective.
Back on the right here. Am I right?
I want to put a plug for maintenance. If you maintain things, then you don't have to replace them as often. But my question is, one of the earlier slides said that there are enterprise improvements. I think this slide was labeled future capital expenditures, large-scale future capital expenditures. What enterprise improvements are planned? Sounds like a miscellaneous bucket.
Is that
So-
to Steve?
Yeah,
or-
well, I assume,
Certainly not.
you're talking about, asking about Concord.
Yeah, I just want to know what exciting things
Well-
can we contemplate spending money on?
The big one, all kinds, I mean, we don't have time for that. No, the big one that jumps off the page is water treatment facility at Nagog. That's the big one. But I know they are also looking at the wastewater treatment plant, the sewer plant.
Yes.
So
That's something
those are the
that's
two
not-
biggies, but you also have water main replacements that can get kind of spendy too.
I thought that was just put in, like, whenever they did roads. They do X number of miles of roads every year, 10 miles or something, and they always do the water mains at the same time.
I don't know that they always do it. It depends, I'm sure, on the condition of the main. But when we do it, the enterprise fund does pay for it, not the general fund, like the road budget doesn't pay for that. That work for replacing main is still carried by the enterprise fund.
Thank you.
How about one more question?
Oh, actually,
Yeah.
so if there's no more, I just want to make a follow-up point, because you raised a good, how do people know? And I think one of the things that I'm hearing from the discussion of the task force is there may be somewhat of an information gap, and I think the thing I just want to assure everyone of is that that stuff does happen. I mean, I'm new here, but I am working with the department heads in the SMT, and the stuff that Mark is talking about, it doesn't look like that. It was not a standalone committee yet. But all those processes happen through the departments and in communication with the select board or public works commission, depending on whether or not it's an enterprise fund thing. So I just want to give people, like, there is a capital plan. It does have tons of charts and graphs. There is a lot of information about each project. We do, like Mark said, we don't replace a vehicle just because it had a birthday. A lot of that effort, there are intake forums that ask questions about replacement versus repair, maintenance. I mean, all of that information is collected every single year, so I don't want people to feel like we're just kind of willy-nilly, throwing stuff on the warrant. But obviously, we need to do a better job of communicating that with town meeting voters.
I do want to add, though, that yes, there are many spreadsheets that show plans, but the integration between the schools and the town, there's room for improvement there.
Sure.
So,
Stephen did not ask me to protect him. I don't need to do that. But, and I think we're a fairly sophisticated group about town activities here, but I've been around town long enough and involved, finance committee, et cetera. And I saw Chris Whalen over many years. Give the guy a break for at least another year.
Wow, you think that long?
why?
Yeah, that's to say. So,
He
yeah,
can't be expected to know everything that some of us know. There are a lot of reports out there. I'm sure he will read in due course. They're helpful. But at least, give him a little leeway for a short period of time.
just wait. One more comment. I'm sorry,
Yeah.
but thank you for that.
Well,
Tom, I
I
appreciate it. And what I don't know, I will just make up an answer. So don't worry about it.
True politician.
Yeah. So
Which-
one of the things
who knows?
because I appreciate bringing up collaboration with the schools, because I know
Yes.
when I was in my job interview, I was asked about this. When I got to Long Meadow, and I've only been here 5 months, so I'm going to relate to my prior experience. When I got to Long Meadow, my first town meeting, I didn't prepare the budget because I started in April. But my first meeting was the select board was going to cut the school's budget, and so the schools were going to cut the music program. You remember that slide about the school's flexibility with funding? So obviously they didn't have to cut the music program, but they knew it's popular, and that got 500 parents who had never been to town meeting before. And guess what happened? Schools
got
got the
their
money,
budget.
the parents left, town meeting adjourned with an unbalanced budget because they didn't offset the increase in the thing, and we had to fix it in our Long Meadow also had a regularly scheduled fall town meeting. And I realized, having started my career in the legislative environment, you know, I know how to count votes. And so one of the things I set to in Long Meadow is working closely with the superintendent. And I did, and the last 3 budgets were balanced, under 2.5%, and unanimously approved because we worked it all out with the schools in advance. On my second day as town manager of Concord, I met with Dr. Hunter and said, you know, we're gonna do this together, and she is an excellent partner, and we communicate at least weekly on a whole host of issues. Sometimes it's personnel things, sometimes it's, you know, budget stuff, and so you like, because I'm new, you haven't really seen it in practice yet.
Right.
But just, you'll have to take my word for it that that is one of my big goals and missions is to work collaboratively with the schools, because we are one organization. There's not 2 separate organizations. So you have my commitment that that's a high priority for me.
We look forward to having the school budget come in at 2.5%.
On that
Don't hold your
note,
breath.
I would love to thank our wonderful speakers, our moderator. Thank you all for coming to First Friday, and I hope we'll see you at many more league events. Lori, do you, yes, please, applause, thank you so much. And Lori, is there anything else
No,
that we
but to
need to
thank
announce?
everybody.
Okay, but thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
This was a fantastically educational opportunity for us.
See you, Mark.
Thank you. You really earned it.